Hi, hello, welcome to Unknown Reviews. I've had a day today, but it's fine. I'm happy you're here, happy to be talking about Armand We Buy Diabetic test strips. I filmed a reaction to this video back when it came out, and during that reaction, I kind of basically was like, there's so much going on in this album that it's just impossible for me to actually understand on first listen. And I was like, it's going to take me months to actually get what's going on this album, and that's exactly what happened. And so that's why I haven't really made a follow-up video until now, because it's literally taken me this long to actually get my arms around what on earth is going on in this project. So now that I've spent some time with the album, I kind of want to just give a little bit of thoughts on how I feel about it now after some time has passed, which is really the only way to actually even like assess or take in or process an Arm & Hammer album, because it really even feels like unfair doing a first reaction. Like, I want to do it. I know y'all wanted to see me kind of like just react in real time to what they brought to the table, but I think the reason why this album is so hard to kind of wrap your arms around at first, and I know like a lot of people liked it when it first came out, but just as many people were like, I have no idea what's going on here. It's because they don't trust us. They don't trust me. They don't trust you. They don't trust the listener who is actually just a consumer. It kind of reminds me of that one Elucid line. I think it was on Rehearse with Ornette off of Paraffin, where he says, 50 people at a rap show, one's an informant. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's just this idea that, and if you've seen them in concert, you know this. I've seen them twice now. They're always just a little bit wary, especially Billy Woods, of just like, who is listening to him and what they're listening to him for. And so I think because when you really start digging deep into it, what I found is like the themes on this album are so personal and emotional to both Woods and Elucid, it kind of makes sense that they wouldn't be super open to just spelling out exactly what they're saying and feeling for anyone and everyone to readily be able to kind of like consume and, you know, take in, because they don't trust us, you know, initially. I think the reason why it's so dense is because they're like, if you take the time to actually understand what we're talking about and appreciate it, not just as art, but as a communication of who we are as people, then we can trust you enough to kind of give you what we're actually talking about. I think that's why Professor Sky has gotten like a Woods interview and is like, you know, really kind of been able to connect with them, because he spent so much time really digging in. And I think honestly, Arm & Hammer purposefully puts that gate up to kind of keep away people who are there to consume just for the sake of consumption, which puts them in a really interesting spot with this album, in the sense that I do think it's the most abstract thing that they've ever done, but I think it also kind of marks a little bit of a change in terms of their place in the underground rap space, I guess you could call it, because this is the first album that they had with like a major label, Fat Possum Records. There was definitely a bit more of a marketing push behind this album. 4 tracks, you know, by JPEG Mafia, who they collaborated with back in 2017, but now Peggy is one of the most influential producers in the rap game, period, hands down, end of story. And to have his fingerprints really all over this album, and it's a beautiful combination of these two worlds, it puts them in a really interesting space. And you can see them kind of building off of the success of Haram with The Alchemist, and you can see it like reflected in their listenership, which is really interesting. Part of me actually wonders if this album is so abstract because they were fully aware that they're gaining in notoriety, and so they're kind of like weeding out who's actually going to be there to really listen. So before I get into some of the like deeper themes that I've really started finding with this album, how do I feel about the album just in general as a whole? Like now, after listening to it, just track list from top to bottom, I would say a lot more of the tracks have grown on me from first listen. There were a few that I listened to that I still, you know, pretty much every week I turn on, like Landlines, Ask Siri How I'm Gonna Die, which those 2 tracks are incredible. I Keep a Mirror in My Pocket has really stuck with me. I think Cavalier gives hands down the best feature on the album, and honestly probably one of the best verses on the album. I'm still wrapping my head around exactly what he's talking about, but it's captivating. And it was so cool to see him perform that live when I got to see them live in Philly. That track is really solid. Supermooned. The Gods Must Be Crazy with LP, I really started kind of getting my head around. A lot of the tracks on here, honestly, almost all of them, some of them I don't listen to as much as others because that's not that kind of song that has like a ton of replay value. But I really have felt over the past few months, the more that I listen to this album, the more I begin to understand it. I feel like on Paraffin, they were angry. Like, it was an angry sounding album. Every single track, it was abrasive, it was all over the place. Like, you had Black Garlic, Rehearse with Ornette, Sweet Mickey, No Days Off, which was like, I think one of their most streamed songs before Haram came out, and it's really just kind of this anthem, right? There's a lot of political commentary on there. I think Elucid really kind of charges ahead on that album. And so that track, when I think of that track, I just think of like just anger, right? And frustration. On Haram, it's a little bit more mystical, and there's a lot of historical references and this constant kind of like weaving in and out of like things going on in the past to what's going on now, and a lot of still like, you know, political commentary, socio-political commentary, all those different things, but it's woven in with, you know, a little bit more of like Billy Wood's experience, you know, and he went even further in that direction on Ethiops, and even just also pairing it with The Alchemist also provided it with a totally different set of like just soundscape and the cohesion between all the different tracks. Just a fantastic album. And when I think of Haram, I think more of that, right? But with this album, honestly, in some ways, I think that they're more personal than ever. There's this sense of bewilderment all across this album. That's the word I kept coming back to. I know it's a weird word, but I kept coming back to that word when I thought of this album and how digital it sounds and how there's so much in the lyrics about what's real, what isn't, what's fake, you know, what's authenticity versus what's inauthenticity, how, you know, the digital world and landscape has forced us to kind of like compromise in that way, and how it's really kind of stressed and stretched what we consider like real human connection, and just how disorienting living in this time period is, specifically from two people that are not, you know, most of the people watching this are probably not Gen Xers, right? I don't know if they count as Gen X or you know, older millennials or whatever, but basically they're not 20, right? But this picture that they paint, it's kind of like dystopian and like post-apocalyptic almost, and I just think that really from both of them, it seems like they, on this album, there's just this sense of discomfort and fear and longing. I think that's the other thing too. When you really listen to the lyrics, when you listen to Elucid talking about feeling disassociated from himself. On Switchboard, there's this refrain that he has where he says there's a face inside this mask inside this face, and then he keeps repeating so many people at the same time, around this kind of like swirling ambient, you know, like disassociative soundscape. Woods tells one of many stories on the album of him, you know, one night stand with someone, hooking up with someone, or it's like the situationship, friends with benefits, whatever. But as he tells this story, he's weaving in this idea of searching for human connection, but also being unable to actually grasp it. Every time you think you have it, you lose it. And like, there's this one line where he's like, you know, you come home to your lover, how many times can you tell her that you love her? Why was the cellar door open when it wasn't? It's this really interesting melding of like really asking what is human connection. And I think in this album, as weird and strange and abrasive and elusive as it is, I think both Woods and Elucid in their own way are searching for connection on this album and trying to figure out what that actually means. And I think from Elucid's standpoint, if you look at a lot of his verses, I think that he's really kind of attacking it from what does connection mean in the digital age, and this sense of feeling separate from yourself, you know, feeling kind of like depersonalized, which I honestly relate with a lot. And I think that Woods is kind of, and they both touch on both issues, but I think Woods is kind of attacking it from how he is searching for that connection and a lot of times unable to find it through sex and through like all the different stories that he tells on the album. That is, a lot of times it just ends up with him with some woman in a hotel room or like on the couch, and it's just that's all he's talking about. But the way he perceives the situation is so much more ethereal that he brings in all these different elements to it. Woods is kind of attacking it from the angle of trying to search for real actual connection through sex and being unable to find it / coping with this feeling of being disassociated or depersonalized because of the digital age, and trying to kind of cope with that through sex. He kind of like, it's really interesting. He has a couple of different moods and attitudes towards it through, like all throughout the album. But like this verse right off of Supermoon, she doesn't want to be in love, but pulled me in deeper like a supermoon. In the dark, couldn't see her features. Her face betrayed nothing, loyal to the end. Both of us light sleepers, listening to each other's breath until we went again. And that reminds me also of like that clip at the end of Ask Siri How I'm Gonna Die, where there's this phrase that I think really is one of the most important moments on the entire album, where it's the snippet at the end where this guy is on the phone with Billy Woods and just says, "Life is like tomorrow's breakfast. When a lion wakes up, he knows to hunt a gazelle." It's this idea of hunger and desire and longing for something. On that same track earlier, in a Lucid's verse, which I also think is one of the most important, that whole song is really the most, I think, important track on this whole album. He has this line where he says, "I'm filled with an empty pot." And that is just like, really, when you think about it, it's really personal and vulnerable things to even be expressing. And I don't think that it's really kind of talked about a lot in, rap circles or even in music in general, that idea of really, truly, genuinely feeling disconnected from yourself as a person. And I think that it's a thing that a lot of people relate to, but they don't entirely know how to express. I know that's something that I'm really exploring in my own music as well. And so I think that's why, another reason why it's so smart and so fitting to make this album so abstract, because sometimes there's no way to even really explain what you're talking about. Sometimes it's hard to put in an exact sequential form because it's such a like out of body experience. Like on Trauma Mic, where Lucid says, "Neo folk, trauma mic, echo chamber, deep fake deep, talking wound, say it to my face." And then later in the track he says, "No slave, no world, no slave, no world. Who needs to think when your feet just go? Who needs to think when your mouth just runs?" And then like he kind of closes it out by saying, "I be knowing better, but ain't done it yet. Some don't know no better, and they won't." And then he has a couple of lines after that. And these feelings just keep permeating all throughout the album. Like on the first track, Landline, where Lucid says, "When your wish is vivid, out of body, I wouldn't do this with just anybody. I'm not finished, I'm a menace to myself. I be bleeding through, I be needing now." And he just keeps going on, with that motif. "Don't lose your job." Woods starts out the verse saying, "Break up weed on one phone, FaceTime on the other, break up with me, I'm a G, I stay friends with your mother." And if you look at literally almost every single one of Woods' verses, which I'm just going to let you go read for yourself because my family's probably watching, but they're almost all a version of a one night stand, and then how he feels about it, or how he feels disconnected, or he's like, "I was about to do this and then I couldn't," or like there's always something, right? He never is able to actually quite get to that place. And sometimes he finds like for a brief moment there's that sense of connection, or at least there's this almost kind of numbing of the senses to everything else that's going on around him. And then sometimes he just completely is unable to reach that place at all, and he's fully aware of how transactional whatever relationship he's in is. And that's the thing that you'll see too all throughout this album. There's no point where he's like, "Yeah, I'm in this great situation with this person that feels awesome about me, and I feel great about them, and any of the intimate moments that we have are out of love and not this constant state of discontent that we're trying to fix and problem solve." Like that's the other thing too. I feel like on this album both Woods and Lucid are kind of illustrating the different ways that people truly deep down at their core feel discontent. That's why it makes so much sense that this album is so hard to grasp, because that's actually what they're talking about. For Lucid and a lot of his verses, at least this is what I'm getting, and I know there's other parts to the commentary, I'm sure, because again, like I said, half of this album I still don't understand. Hold on, let me find I was trying to find this earlier. Let me find this lyric that Elucid said, literally talking about this exact thing. Hold on. Earth getting warmer, we going the other. I can't do much but eat my colors. Said what I say and really mean it. We already in between what's written, make it hard to read. He's just telling you right there, everything that I'm saying has a point and has a purpose. I'm intentionally trying to make it difficult for you to understand because, again, really, it's a very deep and dense and dark and challenging personal thing. There was this one line that he said, I think it was on, I don't even remember, but he was like, she said she saw my other face when I was right? And then he was like, I know I'm wiping saliva off myself. And it was just this image of just like carnage. Like, I don't know, there's pause. Like, there's a better word for that probably, but there's this sense of this just hunger and desire all throughout this album. Sometimes even on this album, it's just wanting peace, and the different ways that they try to find that, they try to maintain that, hold on to that. Like, I feel like a big note that Elucid kind of touches on is this idea. And it actually reminds me of a previous verse that I think was on Scaffolds by Elucid, where he says, I believe in black secrecy. I think for Elucid, I could be off here, but I think a note that he touches on this album is the idea of like this elusiveness, this kind of secrecy that is all throughout the album. It's not only just because of a lack of trust in the listener to a degree, but it's also, he's like, this is how I maintain my peace. This is how I kind of, like, there are parts of me. He talks about like old earth, and he talks about like jewels a lot on this album. There are parts of me that are sacred and spiritual that I can only maintain by making it very hard to access, even though I still need to express these things at the same time. It's a really interesting balance, and I think the same can be said for Billy Woods in much different ways, and it's, he's talked a lot about that as well, all those different things, right? But I think the thing that's interesting about this album, and I think why it's just going to be really interesting to see where they go next, and the influence that this album has going forward, because again, like I said, it's a little bit of a bigger platform, and just sonically, it's so incredible. Like, I could talk forever about that. I mean, but it really is from front to back just genius in the way that it's constructed and produced. But I think whereas with Paraffin, we saw them really kind of talking about a specific topic, and with Haram, it was kind of a little bit more of like world building. At least in my mind, it was just so much more of like an adventure, and every track bled into each other. I feel like this kind of takes some of the more personal aspects of Paraffin and the kind of like world building and kind of like cinematic overarching narrative of Haram, and kind of puts the two together, takes their most saturated aspects, times it by 2, and adds even more personal in there, to where I feel like this album in a way almost kind of helps clarify those two albums and where Woods and Elucid come from as artists even more, but also I think is the most complete and clear actual portrait of who these two artists are and where they're coming from and what is important and interesting and pressing to them. And it's really wild, because when you listen to it at first, it's their hardest to understand, and I still think it's really hard to understand. But I think it's in some ways the most clear and complete picture of Armand Hammer as a project. And so that's just been really fascinating to uncover. And I'm not done yet. I'll probably update this in another month or 2 months, because there's so much more. Now that I'm finally like at the door of what this album I think is about, I'm really excited to just like run through and really dive in now that things are starting to finally come together. But I would love to help you speed me through that process and let me know what you think about some of the tracks on this album, about where they're coming from. I didn't even get a chance to mention how important some of the features are. Again, even the inclusion of JPEG Mafia, it's so perfect, especially, how Elucid literally closes out the album, or at least his last verse on the album, saying, "You don't know my name," which of course is Peggy's "You Think You Know Me." It's that same energy, and all the features add to that sense of like, only certain people can come through this door and understand what we're talking about. And what they're talking about is just really incredible and interesting and really personal. And I don't think it's talked about in the ways that they talk about it. which is just it's really interesting to explore. So I'd love to hear what you're thinking about it. What's been your relationship with the album so far? I think it's probably a masterpiece. It seems like a masterpiece. It feels like a masterpiece to me. And I'm sure I'll probably just continue to be like reaffirmed in that, like assertion as I continue listening to the album. But for a minute there, I was a little bit worried. I was like, did they go too far? Is this too left field? And now I'm listening and I'm just like, no, of course not. This makes perfect sense. So yeah, really enjoying this album. Would love to hear what you think about it. Definitely check out the tons and tons and tons of Armand Hammer videos that I have to this day. To this point, I believe I have a playlist somewhere on the channel. Definitely go check those out. And also, speaking of new-ish music, but new music for me, my stuff is coming out tomorrow. My first 2 releases under the Asayanea stage name. What are the names of the songs? Oh my gosh. Anova and God Cries. Music video dropping tomorrow. And I'm also going to be talking a little bit about my creative writing process. So if you've been watching me and you've been hearing me talk about all these other artists and what we can learn from them, this is what I've learned from myself in going through that process, and some things that might be useful for you to kind of hear in terms of my experience and the ways that I learned and changed as an artist, and just some of the context behind my own work. So lots of stuff coming out on the channel. We'll definitely be revisiting Armand Hammer, a couple of other releases that I want to touch on, but that is all for now. I'm supposed to be somewhere right now, and I am very, very, very late. So I'm going to go. Have a great rest of your day. Go listen to We Buy Diabetic test strips, and yeah, goodbye. Bye. Follow me on Instagram at a.cyanea music. Bye. Bye.